The snow had fallen for 3 straight days, blanketing the Wyoming plains in a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the world itself. Luke Hartman guided his weary horse Jasper through the drifts, the animal's breath steaming in the frigid air. The world was white and endless, with no sign of life except the lonely silhouette of Luke himself, wrapped in his sheepskin coat and wide-brimmed hat dusted with frost. The wind howled like a restless spirit, slicing through the seams of his clothing and biting at his skin. He had been out all morning checking the fence lines around his ranch, though deep down he knew it was hopeless. The cattle would not survive much longer in this storm, and he'd already lost 2 to the cold. Still, he couldn't sit idle. Doing nothing always gnawed at him worse than the wind dot. As Luke reached the ridge overlooking a narrow creek frozen solid, he saw something that made him pull sharply on Jasper's reins. There, half buried in the snow near a fallen pine, was a dark shape, still as death. At first he thought it might be a wolf. Then he noticed the small size, the bare feet, the tattered scraps of hide clothing. His heart tightened. It was a child. Luke dismounted quickly, stumbling through the drifts. The boy was native Shoshone, by the look of his beadwork and braids, though they were stiff with ice. His lips were blue, his tiny body trembling weakly. Luke knelt beside him, brushing snow from the child's face. "Hey there, little one. You're all right now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The boy's eyes fluttered, open dark, wide, and filled with fear. He tried to pull away, whispering something in his own language that Luke couldn't understand. The rancher raised both hands in peace. "Easy, son. I ain't gonna hurt you." He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the child, then scooped him into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. Luke could feel his ribs beneath the coat. Without a second thought, he mounted Jasper with the child held tight against his chest and turned toward home. The wind cut harder now, as if testing his resolve, but Luke set his jaw. He'd lost too much already: his parents to fever, his brother to the war, his cattle to the cold. He wasn't about to lose this boy, too. The ride back took more than an hour, the snow thickening to a blinding white wall. Luke's cabin was a lonely outpost on the edge of nowhere, but its small light shone like salvation when it finally appeared through the storm. He burst through the door, carried the boy to the hearth, and laid him down beside the fire. Jasper neighed outside, shaking snow from his mane, but Luke barely heard it. He filled a pot with water, set it to warm, and threw more wood onto the flames until the room glowed with golden light. The boy's name, he learned later that night, was Tahoe. At first, Tahoe didn't speak, just shivered, eyes darting between Luke's face and the flames, ready to bolt at any moment. But when Luke offered him warm broth from a tin cup, the boy hesitated only a moment before drinking. His hands were small and scarred. When he finished, Luke noticed him glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to come. The thought tugged at Luke's chest. "You got family out there, don't you?" he asked softly. Tahoe didn't answer, but his gaze dropped to the fire. And Luke understood that through the long night. Luke tended to him, feeding him small bites of bread, rubbing warmth into his frozen feet and draping another blanket over him. As the hours passed, Tahoe's breathing steadied. Luke sat back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him, but he couldn't look away from the boy. He'd never seen anyone so young carry such a look of old sorrow. Somewhere beyond the snow, a mother was likely praying for her son, never knowing he lay safe in the home of a cowboy. When morning came, the storm had calmed, leaving a silver stillness across the land. Luke opened the door, staring out at the world reborn under sunlight, and thanked God the boy had survived the night. He didn't know what would come next, whether the tribe would come looking, whether they'd see him as friend or foe, but none of that mattered. All he knew was that he'd found something worth protecting again. And so, As he looked back at Tahoe still sleeping near the fire, Luke felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Not hope exactly, but the start of it. For 2 days, the snow never stopped whispering against the cabin walls, soft and ceaseless like breath. Luke Hartman stayed close to the hearth, tending the fire and watching over Tahoe as the boy's strength slowly returned. The cabin, once a place of loneliness, had found new purpose. The air smelled of wood smoke, melted snow, and the faint scent of healing. Luke could almost forget the world outside almost. Tahoe spoke little at first. When Luke tried to ask where he'd come from, the boy would simply lower his eyes. His small fingers would tighten around the bowl of soup Luke placed in his hands, and he'd eat in silence. But sometimes, when the light caught his face just right, Luke saw flashes of gratitude and something deeper fear that hadn't yet faded. The boy had been through more than hunger. On the third morning, Luke woke to find Tahoe sitting up near the window, wrapped in the wool blanket, staring at the falling snow. The boy's hair was still matted with frost at the ends, and his thin shoulders trembled with each breath. Luke poured hot water into a tin mug, stirring in sugar, and walked over. "You ever seen snow like this before?" he asked, his voice soft so as not to startle him. Tahoe turned slowly, eyes dark as wet earth. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, snow come. Every winter." His voice was hoarse, the words broken but understandable. It was the first time Luke had heard him speak English. Luke smiled faintly. "Well, guess it don't care who it freezes, cowboy or Indian." The boy's lips twitched upward, just a little. That half-smile, fragile and real, did something warm to Luke's chest. "You hungry?" Luke asked. Tahoe nodded again. "Always hungry," he whispered. As the days passed, Luke learned to read the boy's silences. He discovered that Tahoe liked to sit near the fire and watch the flames dance, his small hands folded as if in prayer. He liked the sound of the harmonica Luke played in the evenings, soft tunes that drifted through the wooden cabin like lullabies. Sometimes when Luke played slow and low, he'd catch Tahoe humming quietly under his breath. Following along with haunting little melodies from his people, Luke never pried. But small pieces of truth began to surface like stones through thawing snow. The boy had been separated from his tribe when soldiers rode through the valley weeks ago. His mother had been injured, and in the chaos, Tahoe had run into the woods. He'd been lost ever since, surviving on scraps, sleeping beneath trees while the blizzards rolled through. 3 sons. "No food," Tahoe said one night, tracing shapes in the dirt floor with a stick. "Then I fall." His gaze flicked to Luke. "You find me." Luke's throat tightened. He looked into the boy's eyes, those deep, ancient pools of resilience, and nodded. "Yeah, I found you. Guess we both got lucky." That night, Luke dreamed of his younger brother, Samuel, who had died years ago in a skirmish with raiders near Fort Bridger. He remembered the boy's laughter, his way of calling Luke Big Brother even when they were both grown men. When Luke woke, the fire had burned low, but Tahoe was sleeping soundly beside it. For the first time in a long while, Luke didn't feel completely alone. By the 5th day, the wind had quieted. The snow glittered under the morning sun like crushed diamonds. Luke decided to head to the barn to check on Jasper and what remained of the cattle. He bundled up and told Tahoe to stay inside, promising to return soon. The boy nodded obediently, though Luke noticed his eyes follow him with unease, as if afraid he might not come back. Outside, the world was breathtaking in its stillness. Frost clung to every fence post and tree branch. Luke trudged through the drifts, his boots creaking against the snow. Inside the barn, Jasper snorted softly, stamping his hooves. Luke fed him a handful of oats and ran a gloved hand down the horse's flank. "We'll make it through, old boy," he murmured. "We always do." But then, as he stepped outside again, Something caught his attention, a flicker of movement near the tree line, far off in the distance. He froze, squinting against the white glare. It was faint, but unmistakable. A dark figure moving through the snow. Then another. Luke's pulse quickened. He knew better than to panic. He turned slowly, pretending to adjust his coat, and walked back toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door, checked his rifle by the hearth, and looked at Tahoe. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, stringing beads from a small pouch Luke hadn't noticed before. "Tahoe," he said quietly, "you see anyone out there lately?" "In the woods?" The boy's hand stilled. His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to Luke. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he whispered, "They come." Luke's heart thudded. "Who comes?" "My people," Tahoe said, voice trembling. "They look for me." The words struck Luke like a hammer of relief and worry all at once. Of course, they'd be searching for him. But what would they think, finding their child in the home of a white man? A cowboy, no less. Luke's hand tightened on the rifle stock, not out of fear for himself, but for Tahoe. "All right," he said after a long pause, forcing calm into his tone. "Then we best make sure they know you're safe." That evening, as the sun bled red across the snowfields, Luke stood on his porch, scanning the hills. The air was so still he could hear the faint creak of the trees shifting in the cold. Somewhere beyond sight, the Wind River Shoshone were moving through the forest, following tracks, searching for a boy they feared dead. Luke didn't know what tomorrow would bring, gratitude or vengeance, but deep down, he understood one thing: he would stand his ground. No matter what died inside, Tahoe slept peacefully, wrapped in the same coat Luke had given him the day he'd found him. Luke sat beside the fire, the orange light painting his tired face. He thought of the world outside, of the fragile bridge between two peoples built on one small act of mercy. And as the fire crackled, he prayed quietly, fervently, that the morning would bring peace, not war. Morning came on pale and cold, the horizon bruised with gray light. Luke woke to Jasper's restless neighing from the barn and the uneasy silence that followed. Something in the air felt different charged, like the world itself was holding its breath. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped onto the porch. At first, he saw only snow and silence. Then, as the sun began to rise, the valley below shimmered with movement shadows spreading across the white. Luke blinked, his breath freezing in the air. What he saw next made his heart stop. Riders. Dozens of them. No hundreds. Moving in perfect silence, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. Spears and rifles glinted faintly in the pale dawn. They came over the ridge like ghosts, their faces painted, their braids catching the wind. The Wind River Shoshone had come, and not in small number. Luke counted at least 200 warriors before he stopped trying. For a moment, his instinct screamed to bar the door, to grab the rifle. But he didn't. He just stood there, still as the frost itself, watching them approach. Fear prickled down his spine, but so did something else, a strange calm. This was not an ambush. This was a reckoning. Inside, Tahoe had woken. The boy stood at the window, eyes wide. When he saw the riders, his lips parted, and he whispered something soft and trembling in Shoshone. Then, before Luke could stop him, he ran for the door. "Tahoe." Luke called, but the boy was already outside. Darting through the snow barefoot, the blanket trailing behind him, the warriors reined in their horses as the child appeared before them, shouting words in their tongue that Luke couldn't understand. Their leader, a tall man with broad shoulders, feathers braided into his hair, and eyes hard as obsidian, dismounted. He knelt, clutching the boy's face in both hands, searching him for injuries. When he saw the warmth in Tahoe's cheeks and the life in his eyes, his expression broke relief flooding over his stern features. He said something quick and guttural, and the others murmured in unison. Luke stood on his porch, unmoving, though every instinct in his body screamed caution. He knew one wrong move could turn this into bloodshed. Slowly, he set his rifle down on the railing, hands visible, and took a step forward. The leader's gaze shifted toward him, and in that instant, the entire world seemed to freeze. Two men, one white, one native, locked eyes across the snow, neither blinking, neither speaking. The cold wind carried the weight of generations between them. Then Tahoe turned. "He helped me," the boy called in halting English, his voice echoing across the quiet valley. "He saved me." The words hung there like a miracle. Luke's chest tightened. He took another step forward, nodding slightly. "That's right," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's all I did." The leader studied him for a long time, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he said something sharp in his language, and several warriors dismounted, approaching cautiously. Luke didn't move. One of them, a younger man with a beaded armband and a scar across his cheek, walked right up to him, circling like a wolf sizing up prey. Luke met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. Finally, the older man raised a hand, and the younger one stepped back. The leader walked toward Luke himself, stopping a few feet away. Up close, Luke could see the man's age not old, but marked by wisdom and scars. He wore a necklace of bear claws and a robe stitched from elk hide. "You take child," the man said slowly, his English rough but clear. "Why?" Luke's breath fogged between them. "Because he was dying," he answered simply. "And no one deserves to die alone in the cold." For a moment, there was only silence. The warriors watched, waiting for their leader's word. The snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, the wind whispering around them like an unseen spirit. Then, unexpectedly, the man stepped closer. "My name Chief Washa," he said. He placed a hand on his chest, then on Tahoe's head. "This one, my sister's son." Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "He's a strong boy," he said. "You should be proud." Chief Washa looked at him long and hard, then reached into a pouch at his belt. He drew out a small carved figure, a bird with wings outstretched, and placed it in Luke's gloved hand. "For you," he said. "You bring him back to life. You have good heart." The gesture stunned Luke more than any words could have. He looked down at the little carving, rough but beautiful, and something inside him loosened. "Thank you," he said softly. Washa gave a single nod. Then he turned to his warriors and shouted a command. In an instant, they moved like a wave, dismounting and spreading out. Luke tensed until he realized what they were doing. They were unloading supplies, meat, hides, bundles of dried herbs, gifts. Tahoe ran to Luke, eyes bright. "They say thank you," he explained, his voice trembling with joy. "You helped me, now they help you." Luke felt his throat tighten. He had never seen such quiet dignity, such unspoken gratitude. The men moved with purpose, stacking wood near the barn, leaving venison wrapped in cloth. One of them bowed his head slightly as he passed Luke. Not a word was spoken, but the meaning was clear. As the sun rose higher, the snow shimmered with life. The warriors stood together in silence for a long while, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the man who had saved one of their own. Then, as if by shared instinct, they turned as one, mounted their horses, and began to ride back into the horizon. Only Chief Washa remained a moment longer. He met Luke's gaze again and said, "Snow will melt soon. When it does, come. My people welcome you." Luke nodded, speechless. When the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The valley was quiet again, save for the soft crackle of melting frost. Tahoe stood beside him, clutching his hand. "They were scared for me," the boy said quietly. "I reckon I was scared for you too," Luke replied, voice thick with emotion. He looked down at the carving still in his palm, the bird with outstretched wings, and smiled faintly. Seems like we both found something worth holding on to. And as the two of them stood there in the snow, surrounded by the silence of the mountains and the ghostly prints of 200 warriors, Luke realized something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from solitude, but the kind born from understanding. From the shared heartbeat of two worlds that had finally, even briefly, met in the middle. The weeks that followed moved slowly, like the last stretch of winter struggling to hold its ground. Snow still covered most of the valley, but the edges were softening, turning to slush beneath the sun's growing warmth. Streams began to whisper again beneath the ice, and the mountains, once buried in silence, now echoed faintly with the distant call of returning birds. Luke Hartman had lived through many winters, but this one felt different. It was no longer just something to survive, it was something that had changed him. Tahoe had regained his strength. The boy's cheeks were full again, his eyes alive with curiosity. He helped Luke around the ranch feeding Jasper, stacking firewood, mending tools with small, clever hands. There was a quiet rhythm between them now, like two souls who no longer needed words to understand one another. Sometimes, Luke would catch himself smiling when Tahoe laughed, a sound that filled the cabin with something warmer than the fire ever could. Each evening, they sat by the hearth. Luke told stories of his younger days on the trail, of his brother Samuel, and the nights they rode beneath skies so clear it felt like you could reach up and touch the stars. In turn, Tahoe began to share fragments of his own world songs in his language, stories of the wolf spirit who guided lost souls home. Though Luke didn't understand every word, he felt the meaning. It was a bridge built one memory at a time. Then, one crisp morning in late March, Luke woke to the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves, and a sight that took his breath away. Across the field, near the ridge where the warriors had stood weeks ago, smoke curled gently into the air signal fires, 3 of them, burning in a perfect line. It was the sign Chief Washa had promised. Luke looked at Tahoe, who had noticed too. The boy's face lit up. "They call us," he said softly. Luke nodded, his chest tight. "Then I reckon it's time I pay that visit." He packed his saddlebag with dried meat, bread, and a small tin of coffee, slinging his rifle over his shoulder more out of habit than fear. Jasper snorted, eager to move after so many idle weeks. Luke helped Tahoe mount up in front of him, wrapping a blanket around them both. The air was sharp but gentle, filled with the scent of thawing pine and wet earth as they rode across the plains. The snow gave way to patches of brown grass and shallow pools of meltwater that mirrored the pale sky. Tahoe pointed out places he recognized where he'd once fished with his uncle, where his tribe gathered roots before the frost. The land, silent all winter, now spoke again through the boy's memories. By late afternoon, they reached the valley that curved along the Wind River. Smoke rose from dozens of lodges made of stretched hide and poles. Figures moved among them, women tending fires, children chasing each other through the mud, men working on boughs and hides. The scene was alive with warmth and community, a heartbeat of life that pulsed through the wild. As Luke and Tahoe approached, conversation hushed. Eyes turned toward the cowboy in his worn coat and broad hat. Warriors stood at the edges, silent and watchful. Luke felt the weight of every gaze, but he kept his chin high and his movements calm. Tahoe slid down from the horse and ran ahead, calling out words in his own tongue. Almost immediately, a woman stepped forward, tall, graceful, her hair streaked with gray. Tears filled her eyes as she knelt and gathered the boy into her arms. Luke dismounted slowly, his throat tightening as he realized this was Tahoe's mother. The woman looked up at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then, with a trembling hand, she pressed her palm over her heart and whispered, "Thank you." Luke tipped his hat. unsure how to respond. "He's a fine boy," he said softly. "Tougher than most men I know." Chief Washa appeared from one of the lodges, his presence commanding as before, but softened by the faintest smile. "You come," he said. "Good." He motioned for Luke to follow. They walked together through the camp. Children peeked out from behind hides, whispering. Elders nodded respectfully. Luke felt like he was walking through a dream. Everything was both familiar and foreign: the smell of smoked fish, the sound of drums somewhere distant, the sight of snow-capped peaks surrounding a valley full of life. In the center stood a great fire. Washa gestured for Luke to sit. The tribe gathered around, quiet but curious. The chief spoke in his own language for a while, his deep voice carrying authority. Then he turned to Luke and said, "You help my sister's son. You save his spirit. You make peace between hearts. This is good." Luke shook his head humbly. "Didn't do nothing special," he murmured. "Just couldn't leave a child to die." Washa smiled faintly. "Kindness is not small thing," he said. "It make rivers flow, snow melt, hearts heal." A woman handed Luke a carved wooden bowl filled with stew rich with meat and herbs. He ate slowly, tasting the care that had gone into it. Around him, laughter began to rise, low at first, then stronger, as if the tension that had once separated them was melting away like the snow outside. Tahoe sat beside him, grinning from ear to ear. The boy wore new clothing, soft buckskin lined with fur. Every so often, he looked up at Luke with eyes that said what words couldn't. "Your family now. Later." As dusk fell, the tribe began to sing. The rhythm of drums echoed through the valley, blending with the hiss of the fire and the whisper of wind through the pines. Luke closed his eyes. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It was gratitude. It was remembrance. It was peace. When the night ended, Chief Washa placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "You have place here," he said. "When the snows come again, you not be alone." Luke's voice caught. "Thank you," he whispered. "I reckon I ain't felt at home in a long time." The chief nodded once. "Then you find it now." As the moon rose high over the valley, casting silver light across the lodges and mountains, Luke looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight, Tahoe laughing beside his mother, the warriors smiling for the first time, the land breathing again. And for the first time since he could remember, he felt whole. He had come as a stranger, a man burdened by the ghosts of war and loneliness. But he would leave as something else entirely, a man who had rediscovered the good still left in the world. Spring came slowly that year, reluctant to let go of the cold. The land thawed one heartbeat at a time, the streams swelling with meltwater, the hillsides dotted with the first signs of green. Luke Hartman had spent several weeks among the Wind River Shoshone, and each day had etched itself deep into his soul. He'd come to understand a rhythm of life far removed from the noise of towns and gunfire, the quiet dignity of people who lived by the earth's own breath. Every morning, he rose with the smoke curling above the lodges and the laughter of children running through the frost. Every night, he sat beside the fire as Chief Washa spoke softly of spirits, rivers, and the meaning of kindness. Tia rarely left his side. The boy shadowed him like a son might shadow a father, eager to learn everything Luke could teach: how to saddle a horse, how to mend a rope, how to read tracks in snow and dirt. In return, Tahoe taught Luke the songs of his people, melodies that spoke of the moon and the wind, of wolves who guarded lost travelers and mountains that kept their secrets. Though their words were few, their hearts spoke fluently. But Luke knew he couldn't stay forever. The ranch needed tending, the fences mending, the cattle feeding. He told Chief Washa as much one morning while standing by the river, its waters clear and cold as glass. The chief listened quietly, then nodded. "The land call you back," he said. "But you carry us with you." Luke smiled faintly. I reckon I will. When he and Tahoe finally prepared to leave, the whole tribe gathered to see them off. Tahoe's mother held the boy close, whispering words in Shoshone that Luke didn't understand but felt in his bones. When she finally let go, she turned to Luke and pressed a bundle into his hands, a necklace woven from sinew and carved bone, with a small eagle feather tied at its center. For protection, she said in halting English. You saved my child. Now this spirit save you. Luke swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. I'll keep it close. Chief Washa approached last, his face solemn but warm. You bring peace where none was before, he said. You show that hearts can see more than skin. Luke extended his hand, but Washa clasped his forearm instead, a warrior's grip. I'll come back, Luke promised. You have my word. You always have fire here, Washa said. When snows come again, you not be alone. And so, with Jasper saddled and Tahoe sitting tall in front of him, Luke turned his horse toward the valley. The tribe watched in silence as he rode away, their silhouettes framed against the rising sun. The boy waved until the camp disappeared behind the trees. The ride home was quiet. The world around them was changing, fast streams gushing with new life, the wind warmer, the scent of pine sharp and sweet. But Luke's thoughts were heavy. He realized how empty his cabin had felt before Tahoe. He thought of the countless winters he'd spent with no one but Jasper and the ghosts of the past for company. That loneliness had nearly buried him as deep as the snow itself. But now he carried something else connection. When they reached the ranch by dusk, the cabin looked different, though nothing had changed. The walls seemed warmer, the yard less empty. Luke helped Tahoe down and smiled. Reckon we've both got chores again. The days that followed were full of simple work. Together they repaired the fences, cleared the barn roof, and planted the first spring seeds. Jasper trotted freely across the fields, no longer weighed down by the gloom of winter. At night, Luke and Tahoe sat by the fire as they always had. But now the boys' laughter filled every corner of the room. One morning in late April, Luke woke to find snowflakes falling again, just a light dusting, the last of the season. He stepped outside with his coffee and watched the flakes drift through the air like tiny feathers. The world was quiet, peaceful. And then he saw them, figures on horseback in the distance, approaching through the soft veil of white. For a moment, his heart clenched, remembering that cold morning months ago when an army of warriors had come to his door. But this time, his chest filled with something else entirely. Joy. As the riders drew near, he recognized Chief Washa at their head, along with several familiar faces. They carried no weapons drawn, only bundles slung over their shoulders. When they reached the yard, Washa dismounted with the grace of a man who moved in rhythm with the land itself. Snow, say goodbye, the chief said, gesturing toward the flakes. We come share last fire of winter. Luke grinned. You couldn't have picked a better time. They built a great fire in front of the barn, the smoke rising into the pale sky. The Shoshone warriors unpacked smoked meat, herbs, and gifts of carved wood. Luke brought out coffee and bread, his laughter mixing with theirs in the cold air. For hours they sat together, speaking little but understanding much. The fire cracked and popped, its glow painting their faces in shades of gold and red. Tahoe darted between them, laughing, his joy contagious. He wore his necklace proudly, half cowboy, half Shoshone, now belonging to both worlds. At one point, he climbed into Luke's lap, the way he used to when he was still recovering from the cold. Luke wrapped an arm around him and looked up at the chief. Never thought I'd see the day our worlds could sit this close, Luke said softly. Chief Washa nodded. Snow teaches, he replied. When cold comes, only those who share fire survive. The words sank deep into Luke's heart. He looked around the faces glowing in firelight, the boy resting against him, the wind carrying laughter into the trees, and he realized this was the life he'd been missing all along. Not the endless ride of a wandering cowboy, but a life rooted in something larger, love, kinship, and understanding. As twilight settled, the fire burned lower, but no one seemed ready to leave. The last snowflakes melted on their shoulders like blessings. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out the little carving Chief Washa had given him months before, the bird with outstretched wings. He turned it over in his hand, smiling faintly. He understood it now. The bird wasn't just a gift, it was a reminder. A symbol of the way a single act of kindness could lift the weight of an entire world. Later that night, when the Shoshone finally rode back into the hills, Luke stood outside the barn long after they disappeared from sight. The sky was clear, full of stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Tahoe stood beside him, small and quiet, his breath misting in the cold. Luke put a hand on his shoulder. "You cold, son?" Tahoe shook his head. "No, warm." Luke smiled, his eyes misting. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." The wind whispered across the plains, carrying the last breath of winter away. And there, beneath the quiet snowfall, a cowboy and a boy stood side by side, two hearts once divided by history, now bound by something far stronger. Not the blood of kin, but the bond of compassion. And when spring finally came to the Wyoming hills, it carried with it the memory of that one winter, the season a cowboy saved a starving native child, and in doing so saved himself.